I'm Morgan Patterson, the Director of Municipal Law at Kentucky League of Cities, for those of you who don't know me. And today we have Chris Johnson, Andrea Schindelbauer Main, and Courtney Bristraw. I'm sure y'all have all talked to us at one time or another. And we're going to talk about legal considerations for reopening cities. Just a few housekeeping notes. If you could go ahead and any questions that you have regarding this webinar or whatever, put that in your Q&A instead of the chat. That way, we monitor the Q&A, and if there are any questions we don't get to, we can email you after the fact. It records those questions, but on the chat function, it doesn't. So if you forget and you put it in chat, Soraya or I will remind you. And feel free, please, to start asking any questions that you have about reopening at any time. You know, we decided to do this particular webinar primarily because of all the questions we've had regarding reopening and the governor's timelines and some of the requirements, what applies to cities, what factors or requirements do not apply to cities. And so we thought we would just go ahead and have this webinar so that you could ask us whatever you need. And if I look like I'm opening the questions and putting them on my screen, so that's why I look like I'm chasing daisies over here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll start with some of the kind of rote questions that we had. And I'm going to ask Andrea and Courtney first because, you know, personnel is something that we all deal with. So the first one, are cities required now to open City Hall for in-person traffic?
Okay. I wasn't expecting that one, so no, they are not required to open to in-person traffic at this time. But if you do, you probably want to have some parameters in place so that anyone who does come in is aware of the social distancing requirements, and if you require that they wear masks, and of course be sanitizing any areas that they may come into. Anything I left out, Courtney?
Not about the in-person, but more generally, we do have a sample policy for cities to consider. It's a good idea to make sure that cities have a written policy addressing what procedures you're taking, particularly in the context of for your employees, how you're sanitizing workstations, how you're enforcing and regulating social distancing and other requirements. So I'm sure we'll talk about it more as we go through, but we do have that sample available as well.
And this question is why, in part, I asked you that question. We have one from anonymous attendee. The governor set Healthy at Work for office standards at an occupancy of 50%. Is there any guidance on when this will be lifted? So do y'all want to handle that one? Or I can. So essentially, those Healthy at Work guides for offices, those are recommendations for cities. If you look at the Healthy at Work guidelines as it applies to municipal offices, it is strongly encouraged that cities adopt those recommendations as well as the guidelines for Healthy at Work generally. And the reason it was important for us to have some latitude, for example, is if cities were required to only have 50% of their workforce in the office and you only have 3 people who work in the office, is that realistic? So the city has the flexibility to have more than 50% occupancy in the office building, as long as the other directives that are actually in executive orders and not simply guidelines are met. And that includes the social distancing, the cleaning and sanitizing Courtney was discussing, and the other recommendations. So our next question, are the League of Cities, are our offices open for in-person? He's visiting Lexington. Or, oh, are we open for in-person visiting in Lexington yet? And that answer is yes, we are. Right now, the directors are coming in at least twice a week. We're alternating schedules. We do have a reduced capacity. You'll notice Chris is in his office. Andrea, Courtney, and I are not. There's no requirement that our other employees come into the office. But if you want to meet with somebody in particular, we'd love to have you. We'll figure something out. And JD's there all the time. He has been all the time. You can tell by his beard. Looks like he's never left the office. No, I'm just kidding. But yes, we are open for that. So what should one do if one city required everyone to return to work and on paper has a requirement to wear masks in common areas, but that requirement is largely ignored?
All right, I'm happy to take it. For this one, the first thing I want to know is, why is the employee ignoring it? Why are they not wearing their mask? Because first I want to know, do they need an accommodation? Is there a medical reason why they can't wear the mask? If there is, we want to try to make an accommodation for them. We can try to figure out what we can do, whether it's teleworking or keeping them separated from other people, and keeping things sanitized like we talked about earlier. If it's just that they're refusing to wear, then you would discipline them like you would any other employee for any policy that you have in place that is being ignored or not being followed correctly. So you want to make sure, if that is your policy, if you expect your employees to wear masks, to make sure that it is in written policy and you've given it to all your employees so that they are aware of it. And they sign an acknowledgement saying so. And that way they can tell you at that time, do I need an accommodation? And again, I can discipline them if they're failing to follow my policy.
And the follow-up is no medical reason. I suspect they're not taking it seriously. So let's see the next question. And Chris, I'm gonna let you handle this one. At what point should the states of emergency be lifted?
Okay, I'll answer this, and that may not dovetail into another area that I was asked to talk about during the meeting. So I may just try to kill a couple birds with one very small stone here. The states of emergency, there are a couple, moving issues with this. As far as at the state level, if I knew that, I'd be in Vegas betting right now. That's a crystal ball we're looking at from all the guidance we have from the public health officials. We're looking at the numbers. And if you look at some of the numbers in some of the states that have opened up, more so than Kentucky, those numbers are coming up. I saw a report today that one of the cities in Texas is looking to, open one of the annex hospitals that hadn't been used up to this point due to the spikes in the numbers of potential ICU beds they're going to have. So it's an influx situation right now. I wish I had a better answer than that. I don't. We have heard from several of our cities discussing lifting a local state of emergency. And one of the concerns that I've had and continue to have with this is, with all of the uncertainty, and again, I know, unfortunately, a lot of my answer is just, we don't know. But what a lot of this uncertainty is, there's still a lot of open questions as to not just the CARES Act, but potentially additional federal help that we are lobbying for hard in Washington, D.C., and with our federal elected officials over. I would hate to see anything done locally, like if your city says we no longer have a state of emergency and you pull that back, that could potentially whipsaw you from being able to apply for monetary relief down the road. So that's something to keep in place. Now, that's not to say if you're in a community that has had no COVID-19 exposure and everything else with that, that's a call ultimately that can be done at the local level. But as far as the potentialities for being able to recoup and recover the costs that you have had associated with COVID-19, frankly, the numbers are still there, that there's still a couple more peaks that we're going to hit before this valleys and bottoms out. So, it's something to be aware of. And, I just, unfortunately, I don't have a direct answer on that, other than just trying to hold my finger up to the wind and try to see which way it's blowing right now. Now, I did mention that we've had cities open up a good bit, and that's great. I'm starting to get calls about wet dry votes. I'd forgotten what those were. We're getting back to some of the business that cities do, more than just selling liquor. I realize we do more than that, but having to do with opening up to meetings and in-person meetings, and we have had the ability to meet up to 10 people. There's a little bit of analysis here that, okay, we can do something. Should we do something? And, a good number of our elected officials are some of our seasoned citizens. They are, of an age to where you're in that at-risk group. I'll neither confirm nor deny that we've had a couple cities where the mayor knows some of the older people may not be necessarily yes votes, and, go ahead and have it. If you can't show up, tough. We need to keep in mind that we still have the allowances for teleconferencing and video conferencing under the executive orders and the guidance from the Attorney General and the statutes that were passed during the session. So many of the city attorneys I've spoken to and the cities I've spoken to are open to going back to having an in-person component, but still using the allowances for video conferencing under the executive orders and the emergency orders and the statutes that have passed, and with the guidance from the Attorney General that would still allow for that. So that would allow for not just your elected officials, but potentially people in your community who want to be able to participate that, are at an at-risk group or having a compromised immune system or any number of reasons with that. That's something to keep in mind. Another question with this has been trying to keep in mind these social distancing aspects. And we've had some cities that for the regular meeting have moved locations. And is that considered a special meeting at that point? Well, you look at the statutory requirements, and every city should have an ordinance. And if you don't have an ordinance, I don't want to hear about it, but just for your edification, I guess, by ordinance, you set the time, date, and place for your regular meetings. So if you're having your meeting at, the regular time, on the regular date, but you're going to the Civic Center in order to be able to have everybody attend, well, you've moved that location. Therefore, under the statute, that would be considered a special meeting, and you would need to advertise that as such. Now, again, with the video conferencing requirements and the audio conferencing requirements, essentially you're having to notice those as special meetings anyway, so it shouldn't be an issue, but that has come up in one or two of our cities. I see we had a question come in about pertaining to alcohol. We have looked at leaving the to-go aspect in place. If not, what's the guidance on it, as it feels like a Pandora's box issue where we will never be able to fully cease this practice. So far, that is only allowed pursuant to the guidance from the state ABC under the executive orders from the governor. There's nothing permanent about it. It is nowhere written in statutes that allow that. It's just being allowed right now. And, I've seen the takeout Long Island iced teas from Applebee's. They're it looks like a domestic violence starter kit in some ways, that, if you want to have people just be able to walk out the door with that much alcohol, that's fine. But that there's nothing permanent in place that will allow for that after the emergency is lifted. There may very well be guidance from the governor's office and state ABC where they're going to say that's not going to be allowed at this point. But as to whether or not it can or cannot continue, that is fully being handled through the administrative orders from the state ABC by way of the allowance under guidance from the governor's office and the executive orders with that. Now, if you're asking me, do I think there's going to be an expansion of alcohol sales after this is over, for being able to take out a 6-pack of beer if you order a pizza or something? I think that is likely coming, but that is going to only be able to address through General Assembly and through statutory changes. So that's going to be no different than any other expansion. In the last General Assembly, we had the expansion for being able to deliver alcohol and shipping alcohol, direct shipment. So that would be something similar to where it would just be an expansion of either the NQ2 restaurant license to where it would allow for some package license element. So that's something to keep in mind with that as well.
Okay, so for our next couple of questions, our leadership isn't taking the virus seriously either. The mayor has continued to hold open public city meetings and only 1 or 2 people wear masks while the others are not. What can these 1 or 2 people do in response? Andrea?
What can they do? Well, and I think Chris touched on this a little bit, especially if we have some of our more seasoned elected officials, then, they do have the ability to do it by teleconference or audio conference, so they can join in that way. As far as forcing them, I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe having someone from the health department talk to them about the issues, and that, it's important that they do wear it to keep from infecting others.
You're muted, Morgan.
Of course I am. Lynn from Eddyville, would you clarify Personnel Memorandum 2020-07 as referenced in the governor's Healthy at Work guidelines for temperature checks?
So I can take that one. So that personnel memorandum is one that applies to state employees. So that's directly on point for state employees. So part of the executive order references that. Now, if you Google, Kentucky Healthy at Work personnel memorandum, you can pull it up. And there are some good guidelines that are good to follow, but it does not apply to cities. So it would be something that you could take a look at those and see if there are pieces of that you want to adopt, but you would not be required to do so. We have in our sample, which is on the KLC COVID page, we do talk about doing temperature checks. It's not something that's required, but it is a recommendation from the CDC. It is a policy that we follow at KLC, that we are checking our temperatures before we go in. We're not administering those temperature checks, so you can do that a couple of different ways. If you are going to be taking temperatures before an employee comes in, we do recommend having some sort of log to track that, at the very least to track when someone has a temperature, so that you have documentation as to why you're not allowing them to come out onto the premises. Keep in mind those temperature checks would be for employees. It's not something we would recommend for the public at large before they enter. This would be just for your city employees that you could do these temperature checks. And it looks like Andrea was kind enough to share a link to the sample, to the article that then includes a link to the sample policy as well. So.
You're on mute, Morgan.
For the love of goodness. If you're performing your public monthly meetings by Zoom with the option of participating, but at the same time and dates as approved by the governing group, is this still considered a special meeting? And I'll take this one. We have guidance from the Kentucky Office of Attorney General that indicates that if you're conducting a Zoom meeting and you are doing it at the same time you would have your regularly called meeting, or any virtual meeting. I say Zoom, but I'm just used to using it. Any virtual meeting, whether it's WebEx, what have you, it still has to be noticed as a special called meeting. So where you would normally put the location, you would put a link where the public can see and hear everything that goes on during the meeting. However, you are not, as a legislative body, restricted to discussions that are on the agenda. So you still put the agenda up there, you still notice this like a special called meeting, but if the legislative body decides to color outside of the lines of the notice, there's no problem there. And another thing that I wanted to mention with that, a lot of these requirements and a lot of these specifications are not in the governor's orders, but they are in Senate Bill 150. And we'll probably end up talking a lot about this next week at our ACE conference. But anything that's in Senate Bill 150, that's not going to expire until the state of emergency is lifted by either the governor or the General Assembly. And so far, we have no indication that the General Assembly is going to go into special session. So the only mechanism for lifting anything in Senate Bill 150 will be when the governor lifts the state of emergency. And we have no idea when that's going to be. The next question, are you still planning on having a statewide conference in the fall, or is it going to be canceled this year? I think Cassie is on here, and Linda, and maybe Jerry. No final decision has been made yet. I think we're going to be releasing information here in the next few weeks about that. So please stay tuned. Okay. Next, as a company, can we require temperature symptom checks for visitors before entering our facilities to be safe? I think y'all have kind of answered that one. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
I will, now that I'm unmuted. I'm going to include a link to the Healthy at Work stop sign that would be good to post at your entrance if you are open to the public, to remind individuals to not enter a premises if they have been sick recently. So that can be helpful to post, and I will put that in the chat box for everybody. But generally speaking, and others jump in, I think as a public entity, it becomes very icky for cities to administer a temperature check for someone entering a public facility that's open to the public. I'm not sure I would want to be the one to open that can of worms. Now, if you are closed to the public but have some sort of visitor coming in for a meeting, that might be a different discussion, or it might be a different criteria to ask them to not come if they have a fever. But as far as taking the temperature of citizens before they enter City Hall, if it's open to the public, I think that that's probably going to be something that you're going to want to steer clear of.
Okay, so Chris, it's your turn. We're gonna move to June 29th. The governor has indicated that in-person gatherings of 50 or more people will be approved. Our legislative body would like to continue meeting virtually. Is that okay?
Under the guidance under Senate Bill 150 and the current guidance from the Attorney General's office, again, to continue wailing on this dead steed I keep beating, you know, can you do something, and should you do something? Again, I think there's still going to be local decision making involved, and we do have the capability to have these remote meetings with that. Now, there's another aspect of this, and again, I guess it would depend upon, is your consideration having elected officials who are not maybe comfortable showing up as opposed to the general public at large, because you still have the video teleconferencing capability within the statute that outside of the emergency powers under Senate Bill 150 and the guidance from the AG and all these executive orders in place, which, you know, that'd be no different than the mayor going down to Boca Raton for a week or 2 weeks and then, you know, appearing remotely from his hotel room. So you could always avail yourselves of the allowance under the statute to allow for, you know, 1, 2, 3, you know, members to appear remotely from that, outside of that. But again, as long as the executive order is in place and the emergency allowances are in place, even though you have that 50-person you know, limit or cap, I still think you could fold in the allowances for video appearing remotely, not just for your elected officials, but for the general public who may be at risk. I mean, I've got a nephew who is 9 years old. He's had brain cancer twice. He is immunocompromised due to the treatments he had. So I'm very, very mindful of people that may have immunity issues that do not want to be out in the general public. As of now, as of today, I've heard absolutely nothing that would not allow a city to avail themselves of the video conferencing or audio conferencing, depending upon the technological availability of your city to use either one of those options.
Great. And then we have the question, we've been told by the local health department that yard sales are not allowed at this time. We have citizens saying others have said they are covered under the retail opening. Anything you can add on this? Our understanding is that these are covered under the retail reopenings, that social distancing is required. You can't have more than 10 people gathered in the location at a time. Anything that's for sale has to be cleaned and sanitized in between the times that it's been touched, which is consistent with the retail openings. However, we encourage people to work with their local health departments and discuss with them why that decision has been made. We have had some inconsistent responses from health departments as to various aspects of the reopenings, and I think they're just doing the best they can like everybody else. But our basic understanding and the communications that we've had is that they're permissible, but they have to be really, really restricted. And another question, what about checking people before entering a parks and recreation facility, I always put the AL on the end, or before youth athletic sports leagues? Nobody?
Well, I can tell you, when I saw that pop up, I started trying to pull up some of the guidelines, and I do see that some are planning to do temperature checks. The one thing that I think is really important to keep in mind with these temperature checks is that, first of all, it's a medical examination, so that's confidential information. So you have to be really careful with how you maintain this information. And number two, people don't always have a temperature with COVID. So it's really, it may or may not prevent it from being spread. And sometimes even people that do have a temperature may not have COVID. So I'd want to know more. I'd want to see, are they coughing, or what are the other symptoms that would make me want to do that? But I have seen there were some talking about temperature checks of coaches and referees, and maybe not so much the people entering the park, but the people who are actually working the events.
Thank you. And then another question, if the governor has an executive order banning yard sales, why can our local judge exec override that with his own executive order allowing yard sales? Chris is gone. So none of the governor's executive orders directly ban yard sales. However, what they indicate is that regardless of what the reopening is, if there is any circumstance where reopening a business, a service, what have you, is likely to result in gathering of 10 or more people, then you can't open them. Now, I think verbally at one point, the governor said that yard sales and flea markets were prohibited from reopening. And we got more clarification on that to reflect that flea markets, yard sales can reopen similarly to retail facilities with all the restrictions. So I hope that answers your question. And since Chris ducked down, haha. Chris, I know I sent this to you last week. I'm so confused. Why is the state sending information down to clerks? And then
Oh, on the yard sale permits, okay. And Lori, I think I remember looking at this. Um, yeah, I'm sorry, bear with me. I'm refreshing my recollection as attorneys are wont to say. Um, you want my honest answer, or I think this may have been some miscommunication at the state level that filtered down here. I will tell you, Lori, when I got this last week, I reconfirmed the best information we had here at KLC as far as yard sales. And our hive mind here was still that what we've been told at that point was that that yard sales were okay with this. Now, if the state has changed direction or changed course on that, they need to do a better job of getting that out. But we have, at least from what we are hearing here and the inquiries we've had, has been consistent that yard sales are allowed under the retail allowance, again with the social distancing requirements. Frankly, from an enforcement standpoint, how your county health department is going to travel from each and every little neighborhood on the weekends. Frank, I know people are stir crazy, but I think you probably need a mental health examination, not a physical one, if you're wanting to start rifling through people's stuff that has been sitting in their house for goodness knows how long. But that's the best interest we have, or information we have, Lori. And I wish I had a better answer for you. That's all I can say on it.
And I know that it's frustrating to get different information from different people, but this is the best we've got right now. How about the public gatherings like July 4 programs, State Fair, and various fall festivals? Is it up to the individual cities, or does the state have precedence? We are getting this question quite a bit. I'm going to fall on part of the sword, and then I'm going to give it to Chris so that we've been getting this question quite a bit. And I can tell you what we know for a fact is acceptable. Drive-in services were permitted for churches before, when we were very, very strict. So for fireworks displays, for any type of celebration, we know that drive-in services, if people stay in their car, that's absolutely going to be permitted. On June 29th, obviously, we've talked about this, it's going to reopen to groups of 50 or more in-person gatherings. So that gives you a little bit more wiggle room. That being said, we know that there are some cities that are allowing people to come in person if they social distance and if they require or if they meet all of the requirements. So there's that. Chris, I'm going to let you expand on that.
Thank you for throwing that smoking grenade my way. A lot of this is, we've got to defer to our cities to make the best judgment in this situation, and that's going to entail conversations with your local legal counsel. If you all think back to 2 or 3 months ago when this first started, we were getting questions about July 4th celebrations. And at that time, everybody was sort of like, well, we've got time on our side. Hopefully things will kind of resolve themselves by then, but we've got to wait. And we've waited and the numbers haven't quite come down the way we wanted them to, but we're still opening. That's just been sort of a decision that's been made that we've got to open it up a little bit here. Lexington just announced yesterday that they were going to allow for drive-in fireworks and a couple other things, but they've canceled the Bluegrass 10,000 and some of those events. I think the pivot to where this is going to turn on is going to be social distancing. So if you all are looking to do something in your community that is going to draw a crowd, literally, you need to think about if it's challenged or questioned, are you going to be able to, with a straight face, to a state official, a county official, or a judge somewhere, that we're doing this with the best guidance and best allowances under the guidelines for social distancing, and what that means. Now, as far as being able to have fireworks, but allow people to get in the bed of their pickup truck and tailgate, as long as there's a distance between the car next to you. A lot of this, there's a planning aspect to it, and as far as what that looks July 4th, frankly, I think the time frame is kind of working against cities on that. Again, if you're looking at the Banana Festival, and Mike, you pay my freight down there, I will come down happily with bells on and direct traffic or whatever you need me to do. I'm always happy to help. But it's it's going to depend. You've got 2,500 people showing up to your town for the week. There's going to have to be some social distancing in place. And as much as I'd love to say we're going to wake up tomorrow and this has all been a bad dream, it's not. It's still changing, not just day to day, but in some situations hour to hour. I've got a trip planned to South Carolina in August that I'm glad I have insurance on, because I'm not certain I'm going to be able to make it. That was a fallback from having a whale watching trip to Canada. Canadians don't want us there, so had to rethink that. So again, we're always about home rule and making decisions locally. You all are going to best know what's going to make sense in your community. I don't think there's anything wrong with being aspirational with what you want to do, but you've got to have some common sense with it. And that's the longest non-answer I can give. I'm sorry.
Well, and I think, we do have other considerations, even for event insurance. Most of your liability insurance is not going to cover any claims for contracting the virus. And that may be another consideration for cities. We do have another question, and I think we've readdressed this, but I was interrupted during the response to the groups of more than 10 people. Could you repeat, or is this going to be recorded for replay or something posted somewhere I can refer to? This is being recorded, and you will be able to listen to it again. We do have a lot of information available on the klc.org COVID-19 webpage. There are a ton of resources, and pretty much everything, close to everything that we've said here today is on that page in one form or fashion. We have another question. When does a spontaneous First Amendment protest turn into a special event? Okay, that's a great question, and we've had a lot of protest questions lately. It's going to be a matter of shades. I wish I could tell you that a spontaneous First Amendment protest after the second day suddenly turns into a planned event and now requires a permit. It's really going to be a judgment call. And in this situation right now, I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to kind of look at everything that's going on, because that's what the courts are going to do. And everything that I've read, I was knee deep in this yesterday with the protests, and everything I've read, these are all going to be shades of gray. They're going to be very, very fact specific. When you talk about a spontaneous First Amendment or, a protest that's being conducted due to a recent event, I think we're still in the middle of a recent event in a lot of ways, and it's really going to depend upon all the specific facts and circumstances that's going on in your city. And I know there's a lot of, now that we know, I think in Lexington we're on the 14th day of protests. I'm sure there's food, music, and the like, but it's really, I'll throw this back at Chris, because I love throwing him under the bus, but there's no hard and fast rule. I can't give you a bright line there.
There's not been a bus yet built that can run over me, so I'm happy to take this. Hillary, we actually have from a couple years ago when, I don't know if y'all remember when the White People's Party protests were taking part in Eastern Kentucky. I attended a couple trainings on this, and you can consider the source all you want, but they cut their teeth and know this stuff inside and out. I've got a guide that the ACLU actually put together on First Amendment protest guidelines, and it's not. Yes, they do cite a couple Ninth Circuit cases that probably are of questionable application here, but the writ large constitutional issues, as far as the ability to gather on a public right of way versus blocking streets and things like that, are to be considered. But I do think in all of the long jurisprudence of First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of protest, freedom of assembly, is the spontaneous aspect of it. And I do think that there's going to be a strong indication that the spontaneity is going to be somewhat presumed under the current circumstances. But we can post. I think we've all got a copy of that guide. And again, it's just a 20,000-foot overview as far as First Amendment protest right on the federal level, with some focus on Kentucky and the circuit court cases here that would apply to that may be beneficial to you.
Okay, we have another one. What are your thoughts on opening city pools? So there's no guidance yet on reopening city pools. The governor issued a press release indicating that city pools, not just the aquatic centers with the lap lane restrictions and the like, that they will open on June 29th. I looked for it as recently as this morning, and we are not seeing anything on the Healthy at Work guidelines kind of outlining that outlines the various additional requirements for services that are reopening and restaurants and manufacturing centers and the like. There's not even an indication about public pools. So I talked to JD about this a little bit yesterday. Some cities are putting together reopening plans and submitting them under it's govstatus. I'll put it in the chat. There's a website you can go. You can submit a proposal for reopening. I know that Somerset has done that for their splash park. I believe that some other cities have submitted proposals for reopening splash parks or pools. But so far, there are no guidelines. I think basically by June 29th, most businesses are opening at 50% capacity. That's been the primary proposal that I've seen, open at 50% capacity, and following all of the other recommended guidelines for businesses, including social distancing and the like. I don't know if anybody else has more to add on that. I'm going to put this link in the chat. Chris, Andrea, Courtney, y'all want to go swimming? Okay, what are companies doing to handle sales forces that are wanting to start calling again, who may be traveling to and from multiple places, cities, and states during their rotations? Right now, door-to-door sales are still, as far as I know, unless something new has come out that I'm not aware of, they're still prohibited. However, I believe what you're talking about are simply calling on customers and the like. And I don't know what other companies are doing. I know that at KLC, what we're doing is we're communicating with our members. We're making sure that both our members and our employees are safe as they travel to meet. We do encourage that all of the Healthy at Work guidelines are followed. And we even have a training video for our employees about how to handle avoiding contamination when you get gas, when you go to a restaurant, that kind of thing. And I believe that's on our website as well. So that's how we are handling this internally. I don't know what other companies are doing, or whether, I don't know if Andrea and Courtney or Chris have researched this at all. Another question, there is a planned prayer gathering this weekend where local officials have been invited to participate. It will likely go above the current provisions of number of people allowed to gather. Should our local officials participate in such an event? Okay, no one else is jumping in there. This is really going to be a judgment call again. Right now, I think there's a response to the First Amendment marches, to the protests, and other people are wanting to similarly express themselves. I don't really have an opinion one way or another on what people should do. As far as personally, I wouldn't necessarily attend any large scale event. So I don't know if anyone else has any ideas on how to handle it, but I think that's really going to be up to the the local officials.
Well, I'll just briefly address this, because I mean, when you look at, the restrictions have been put in place. I mean, you look at, their health, safety, and welfare concerns is just police powers of the city and the state with this. But Morgan's absolutely right that ultimately, those officials, that's a question that only they can answer as far as the rights that they're wanting to speak out for, because again, there is the cutting with the First Amendment aspects of this, not just the freedom of speech, but freedom of religion that can be in play here. But ultimately, these are questions that only that official or officials can answer, and they ultimately have to decide what their message to their constituencies would be. So it's a decision they have to make.
Since this hasn't come up yet, and we all talked about this morning, I'm going to throw this one out there to Courtney and Andrea, and you've actually had at least an hour to think about this, not much longer. Childcare is reopening on June 15th. I know for a fact that my employee's childcare center is reopened. If he still doesn't come to work, do we have to pay them under EFMLEA? And what are the requirements, and what documentation can the city require?
I can take it, and Andrea, feel free to jump in on anything else. So under the governor's order, child care centers are allowed to open beginning on Monday, but it's up to individual centers to come up with the provisions, and not every child care facility is opening. So of course, in this scenario, it's that they know that it's opening. So that's one consideration. I think at this point, because of the governor's orders being lifted, and Andrea and I have talked about this, and I think it's appropriate at this point to ask that employee, and not technically a recertification, but kind of like a recertification under FMLA, to say, hey, child care centers are able to open. Can you provide documentation to me on whether your center is opening, is not opening? If it's opening, what hours do they have? Because it's very likely, almost all of the centers that I'm aware of, I know that my child care center is doing this, they are reducing their hours because they have to devote staff time to cleaning and disinfecting. So drop off in the morning and pick up in the afternoon are going to be, it's a shortened period of time. My center is typically open 6 to 6. Now it's going to be 7 to 5 to give them that additional time. So it's feasible that even if a center is opening, there may not be childcare available for their entire day. They may need to continue to have EFMLEA time for an hour here or there. That intermittent leave is not required, but definitely encouraged by the Department of Labor. And really for the city, you're going to get the majority of a day of work out of the employee if they're needing to leave a little earlier than normal and take that EFMLEA time intermittently to be able to cover some additional time that's not covered by the daycare facility. I think every other parent that I've talked to, they're getting email notifications from their center, kind of communicating what the procedures are going to be, the times, opening plans. So I think at the very least, when you're asking them for information, they should be able to provide some sort of email document to you outlining what's available. And some centers, even if they're open, they may be limiting particular hours. So any of those requirements would be available, should be available in writing for them to provide to you. If they do not return, you would, if they're saying, yes, it's opening, but I can't do it, you would want to have a conversation about why. And at that point, just determine whether or not it's a legitimate reason, and whether there's some other circumstance going on that you need to be concerned about, and have a conversation with.
Great, thank you guys. So our next question, any guidance on having employees who are out in the field regarding use of masks and social distancing? Would they still fall under the Healthy at Work guidelines for this?
And I can take this one as well. So in our sample, and what we recommend is if someone is outdoors and working and they are within 6 feet of someone else, they need to have a mask on. So that is in line with the federal and state guidelines that if you're not able to social distance, you should be wearing a face covering. So that would apply to those who are out in the field. And then it becomes the same analysis of if they're unable to wear a mask, why is that? Is it a medical reason that you need to discuss? Or is it a safety reason? Is there some safety reason, some other reason that this particular job task, they can't be wearing a mask while they're doing it? And I'm not going to sit here and try to figure out what those might be, but maybe there is something out there that you want to have those discussions. What I would recommend is in your written policy, stating that X, Y, and Z job tasks don't have to follow this, or have some sort of provision in the written policy that you adopt stating that that the executive authority has to approve exceptions to this for non-medical reasons, for reasons other than some sort of accommodation. Because what you don't want to do is just have situations where entire departments who are out in the field ignoring the guidelines without a real basis for that. So if you're requiring the masks, that's kind of the recommendation.
Okay, I appreciate y'all for going through all this. Let's see. So Chris, I'm gonna give this one to you. Since planning and zoning hearings, et cetera, are starting back up, what can the city do with code enforcement?
Well, I mean, you can have code enforcement. There are provisions that do allow for the taking of evidence. And honestly, Morgan, I think you may know more about this than I do as far as the particulars, as far as the evidentiary standards. I do know that there are allowances for the taking of in-person testimony and all that. But frankly, if you don't mind, I'm going to punt back to you on that, because I know you've addressed that far more than I have.
And that's my fault. You're right. I was kind of the one keeping that keeping that in my bailiwick. Some of the language in Senate Bill 150, even though it allows for planning and zoning hearings and other evidentiary hearings, it by video teleconference, some of the language in Senate Bill 150 directly suspends the time limits, the time frames for code enforcement until the conclusion, the lifting of the emergency. So what's happening is that many cities are simply not pursuing code enforcement, because if you issue a citation, if somebody pays it, it's fine, but you really can't follow up with if they don't, file an appeal within 7 days to challenge it. That time frame has been specifically suspended by Senate Bill 150. So there's some issues there. And as we stated, unlike some of the governor's other executive orders that are being slowly lifted, Senate Bill 150 is a codified statute that remains in effect and doesn't sunset until the state of emergency has been lifted. Now, one point of emphasis, if the city is proceeding under its emergency police powers to protect the health, safety, welfare, what have you, of their citizens, there's nothing that restricts the city from exercising its emergency powers in that fashion. So it's kind of a tricky situation from all angles. Okay, so the next question, the child care center is open. The parent chooses not to use the care center because the child has health conditions that make them more at risk if they catch the virus. Does the federal requirement that the city pay 2/3 of the employees' pay apply here?
Well, I'll take this one. This is not going to fall under the emergency FMLA because it has nothing to do with the child care center being closed, but the employee would be entitled to emergency paid sick leave under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act if they still have that time available. So they're entitled to a one-time bank of 80 hours. And if they could not take their child to the child care center and they had a note of or some type of notification from their healthcare provider saying that they recommend that they tell them they should stay home, they should isolate, then they would be entitled to that. But after that 80 hours, it would not, EFMLEA would not apply. And of course, under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, they would be entitled to 2/3 of their salary for that. And, FMLA itself wouldn't apply unless the child was sick at the time. I don't know. I think I'd want to know more details about why they couldn't be there, what kind of care they were required at the time to answer that one.
And like a lot of these questions, I think they're going to be fact specific. So as y'all find out more, feel free to call any of us, mostly Andrew and Courtney for the EFMLEA questions. Okay, we don't have any other questions. Let's see. I'm looking at my little list to see if there are any other questions that I don't think we've hit. Oh, this is one that I think will come up. When cities resume in-person traffic, do we have to allow people requesting open records to review them in person? And as we've written, and as you probably know, Senate Bill 150 suspends the in-person review of open records, and it also gives cities 10 days in which to respond. That is not changed until the state of emergency is lifted. And I'm sure you're going to get a lot of questions about that. Now, sometimes can and should may be two different things. You may want to allow in-person inspection of records, but that's really going to be a policy decision by the city. And I don't know, Chris, have you gotten any of those questions yet?
I have not as of yet, no. One of the few areas I haven't.
Exactly. And is there a link to Senate Bill 150 and what it contains? There is on our on KLC's COVID-19 webpage, and I can also put a link in the chat. Does anybody else, Andrea, Courtney, Chris, do you guys have anything else you just kind of wanted to throw out there to people? I think we're about all tapped out on this right now. Okay, well, it's only going to be dead air for a second while I find this link to put in the chat. Sorry.
While there's dead air, I'll fill it up. Just to emphasize, there's another question, so I will, there's a thank you for that. This has been a helpful process. So of course, we're happy to do that. And it looks like Morgan got that in the chat. I was trying to help fill the dead air for you.
Thank you. I felt like I was on a game show, like I had some little, buzzer in the back getting ready to go off. We do have another question. I'm sure getting a lot of flack over open records right now, and I'm directing people to Senate Bill 150. Is there a huge difference between FOIA and the Commonwealth's Open Records Act? Yes, there is a huge difference between FOIA and the Commonwealth's Open Records Act. When I was a brand new attorney, I worked in federal regulatory, kind of that world for the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and dealt with FOIA regularly. And there's a substantial difference. Under FOIA, you can charge for search time. You can charge for employee salaries. There's a wealth of charges that you can impose when you're the federal government and it's a FOIA. Under the Commonwealth of Kentucky, all the charges are super restrictive. It's 10 cents a page. You don't get your staff time. You don't get any of that. And if you send the records electronically, you can't charge for that either. So there is a substantial difference. And I know that it's frustrating, and especially people from out of town, they will couch it in terms of a FOIA request. I think denying it on the basis of the fact that they used FOIA instead of Kentucky Open Records Act, I don't think the AG would like that very well. And the reality is Senate Bill 150 is what it is. You have 10 days to respond. It gives you a little bit more latitude as a city official as we try to reopen, as we try to do the people's business. And I can understand that people are frustrated when they don't get their records when they want them. However, we've just got to keep people safe. Like everybody said, we need to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens and of our employees. I don't know, Chris, Courtney, Andrea, y'all have anything else on that one? Okay. And Bill Pauley put up a guide in the chat. So if y'all have any other questions, or if you don't have any other questions, there is another one. Someone says their yard sales have already resumed per the local judge executive. And someone else said, appreciate all y'all do. Thank you very much. If there aren't any other questions, as y'all know, you can contact any of us pretty much at any time. We're always working one way or the other. Tomorrow I'm actually going canoeing, so I may not have cell service. That would be the one time you can't get in touch with me. However, I think the rest of the time we're all pretty much on tap. So thank you guys for all that you do. We know how difficult this time has been, and we hope that something that we've said today helps y'all. And just know that we're here with you. So, every time I try to move this question box, if I look like I'm having a seizure, that's not it. Every time I move it, it just like moves all over the screen. So thank you guys very much. And if there's nothing else, we'll see y'all when we see you.